Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Woo! Hello and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast. We are returning from a somewhat lengthy hiatus to discuss all things imaginary in science fiction and fantasy. So I am Ken, and I am here with my podcast co-host, Tony. Say hi.
Hello, I am coming to you from another dimension, a dimension of unreality and nonsense.
Well, if that's the case, then at least you can't crack your usual joke of sneaking up behind us, because that is creepy as hell. So we're going to move right along into today's topic, which is bookstores. We're going to talk about the bookstores which we love and the bookstores where we discover the literature which we talk about on a semi-regular basis here on the podcast. So we obviously do not live in the same state.
Nope.
And we have grown up and visited and spent significant amounts of time in still more states that we do not share. Really, the only state that we share is Arizona, although we did do some bookstore shopping in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho recently, and we'll talk about that in a little while. So if you want to kick us off, Tony, and talk a little bit about what role bookstores play in your discovery process, especially when it comes to sci-fi, but inclusive of other genres, and yeah, just go for it. Has that role changed?
Well, let's start off with the idea for this podcast. So when I was up in Idaho, Kendra came over from Montana and spent a weekend with us, and we went to a few bookstores, one of which I had been to already, two of which I had not. There are, I think, 3 bookstores in Coeur d'Alene, maybe more than that. We went to 3. Anyway, so the one that I want to give a special shout out to, in part because it's an awesome name and in part because it's an awesome store, is the Well-Read Moose. Mm-hmm. And I had this thought because it's a really small store, but they have these 2 wonderful shelves of science fiction and fantasy that are displayed really well, full of recommendations from the folks who work there. Just, I don't know, really pleasing to look at. And I had a thought, there's something about these shelves that is compelling me to look through the recommendations, to see what I own and what I've thought about buying, to consider buying some books that I haven't even heard of, which I then did. And I was thinking, what is it about this hunt for books that actually pulls me in from, hey, I want to go to a bookstore because I like reading, to, I've never heard of this person or this book yet, I'm going to drop $18 on it. What is that? How does that actually happen? So that is the basis for our podcast today. That's the inspiration
for all of this, yeah.
However, that does not answer the question that you asked me. What was the question that you asked me?
What role do bookstores play in your discovery process?
Oh, yeah.
You were getting at it for one particular instance.
So, I go about book buying in 2 different ways. The first way is what I like to call the responsible way. I, check books out at the library, or I browse at stores and find them and take pictures of them if I think they're interesting, but I don't want to buy them or I don't have the money right there. And I always have an ongoing list of books that I want to potentially buy someday, whether that's new or used. So usually what I do when I go into a new bookstore, or any bookstore, it doesn't have to be new, is take a look at that list and see, are those books there? Would I want to buy them there? If I haven't been able to find them anywhere else, do they have them? So that's the responsible way. I hesitate to call it the irresponsible way, though I guess that's kind of what's on the other side of that. But when I go into a bookstore, and this happened at the Well-Read Moose, and it'll happen at a few of the other bookstores that I will mention as we talk, I do look at recommendations. A lot of the time, I will go through and see on the shelves the folks who worked at the bookstore, what they really liked, if we have things in common. Typically, say Erin does a lot of book recommendations, and so does Beatrice. I don't know why Erin and Beatrice were the first names that came to me, but Erin recommends a couple of books that I don't really like, but he has other recommendations for books that I don't know. I probably won't really follow him, but say Beatrice really likes, I don't know, N.K. Jemisin, and is oh, you should read this person, again, who I've never heard of. I'll usually take that book off the shelf, read the back, and maybe buy it. So there's a lot of there's some recognition there, but there's also just sometimes, is this a good write-up? Is the book interesting? Because I'm going to judge that shit by its cover. But like, there's an excellent book that I found at the Well-Read Moose called The Thinking Woman's Guide to Real Magic by Emily Croy Barker, and I had never heard of that, had no idea. I don't think there were any blurbs that I knew. There was no relation between that and other books that particular recommender had suggested. It was a total, like, here's a recommendation, I want to know more about this. Like this book, I'm going to buy it.
Yeah, so, okay, you've already mentioned, I think in a couple of different ways, or you've hinted at the fact that trust is an important aspect of your book discovery process.
Yes.
The bookstore, the Well-Read Moose, taught you to trust its recommendations because you recognized some of the books that you knew you already liked among their recommendations, and that made you more willing to explore some of their other selections, which is, I think, really cool. Now, when I was browsing around the Well-Read Moose, I didn't see a whole lot of those like handwritten recommendation placards that you'll find at some indie bookstores. I find a lot of those at one of the indie bookstores in Missoula, the Fact and Fiction. They have these beautiful handwritten note cards, and they include not just the title of the book and who's recommending it, but like a brief summary of what the book's about or why it's being recommended. Yes. And I didn't see a lot of that at the Well-Read Moose, and I think part of that is because space is at a premium. So I don't know that there were any of the sci-fi books in the sci-fi section that were turned cover out. There were a couple that were turned cover out, face out, on the shelves in the new arrivals, new hardbacks section, but that was a mix of all genres, so it wasn't specifically the sci-fi genre. And that was, I think, the only part of the store where there were face out books. When you go online and look at the Well-Read Moose's website, they have something like 3,000 books in stock, and their storefront is really pretty small. It's not the sort of space where you could bring in a bunch of readers or performers. It's not like a multi-purpose space like a lot of Barnes and Nobles have the kids section set aside for running kids programs, or Powdered Cover in Denver also does something similar where they have space that they can set aside for readings. And that's where I saw Veronica Roth read from her last Divergent book. And so like there's not any of that room in the Well-Read Moose, but they still manage to find these little ways to build your trust in them. And one of those ways is their recommendations, and one of their other ways, I think, is their staff, which was, their staff was super engaging. Yeah. I don't remember the guy's name who was running the desk when we were there, but he followed us out into the street to talk more about science fiction and being a hippie in the 70s, which was pretty cool. Yeah. So, yeah, if your staff is willing to talk to you and genuinely hold a conversation, that speaks volumes about whether I'm going to go the extra mile, and as I did there, spend over $100 on books. On a day.
And speaking of trust and going the extra mile, the one instance in which I will go many extra miles for a bookstore without knowing anything about them is if they're specifically a genre bookstore. If they're dedicated to science fiction and fantasy, and potentially others. I think a lot of them are like science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and other stuff too. But the three that I'm thinking of that I've actually been to are Borderlands and Dark Carnival in San Francisco and Berkeley, respectively, and Mysterious Galaxy in San Diego. In each of those, I have not only bought lots of books, but also felt like there's just this immediate sense of welcome. Like in some bookstores that I've been into, even if I've purchased books there, there's kind of this sense that if I buy a book of science fiction or I buy a book of fantasy, like there's going to be kind of like this side-eye given at me, even if there isn't. There's this kind of like shame attached to it.
Or a blank face at the register.
Right. Whereas like when I went to Borderlands this last time, as an example, I bought Sarah Gailey's A River of Teeth, which she had autographed, by the way, which is another thing that Borderlands is awesome for. But that one of the folks behind the counter said, oh my god, she just did this event, that book is amazing. And I was like, yes, I know, I got it at the library, now I need this copy. And she was already talking to Andrew, my boyfriend, about biological science fiction and what sorts of things exist there. And it's like, the fact that folks are at those shops are not only knowledgeable, which of course they are if they're working at a bookshop like that, but want to engage with you and say, that's a great book, offer recommendations. At Borderlands in particular, they not only have recommendations on the regular shelves, but they have special shelves at the front of the store that are literally just staff recommendation shelves. So this person recommends these 4 books or whatever. So that the trust there is so foundationally present before I even walk into the store that I feel, super comfortable going into those stores. And not only that, but buying things, again, without knowing anything about them, without having heard about them before.
Sure.
Or, I'll spend more money if I'm just going off of my list at a store like that versus a non-specialized bookstore in which I feel kind of like, do I really feel all that comfortable here because blank looks side-eye, so.
Yeah, and actually... There's a flip side to that kind of atmosphere, which is when you're getting the side eye because you don't look like a store's regular customer. And I get that relatively frequently when I go into comic book stores. And so I wanted to give a shout out to the comic book stores which do not make me feel that way, specifically Kapow Limited in Lethbridge. And there is also a wonderful comic book store in Arkansas where I go when I'm visiting my alma mater, and it's Rock Bottom Books in Fayetteville. And these two comic book stores, not only do they have knowledgeable staff who are unfailingly friendly, but they don't seem to judge their customers at all, which I really appreciate. And it's not like the hands-off, no judgment, you're in an adult, movie store. It's none of that, which is its own kind of shame. But it's a you're welcome here, everyone's welcome here. You are exactly who we want in this building right now. Yeah. And that kind of presence is something which, by and large, I feel like we've lost in a lot of our customer service in all sectors. But I think there's more good instances, at least when it comes to bookstores, than in other sort of customer service situations that I've been in recently. So a special shout out to Kapow, where they helped me hunt down Captain Canuck comics, and special shout out to Rock Bottom Books, which provides Alyssa, who we talk about occasionally on this podcast, with her comics, and she sends comics on to me from Arkansas because even though there are some relatively good comic stores in Missoula and Kalispell, that first place where you discover something new that you love invariably becomes your go-to, and it so happens that I'm separated from my comic store go-to by a couple of states. So, and I will keep going back because I love the customer service so much. So, thank you, Rock Bottom Books and Kapow. But going back to what you were talking about with science fiction and these specialist genre bookstores, what about when you can't get to a specialist genre bookstore? So I live in rural Montana. Getting to San Francisco is a once-in-a-lifetime event. In fact, I fell asleep in the airport there once. That was my only experience in San Francisco because I was stranded there overnight in the airport. Yeah. But like for the average person who lives in flyover country like me, how do we discover books? Is there a difference in how we discover books? Are we missing out on something valuable? How can we kind of get a similar breadth in reading experience despite not having access to places like Borderlands and Dark Carnival and so forth?
So you'll be kind of familiar with this, even though I learned recently that you had never actually been to this location when you lived in Arizona. But there's a wonderful local chain of used bookstores called Bookman's. There are 3 of them in Tucson. I want to say 2 in Phoenix, maybe 3, and then 1 in Flagstaff. Each store is enormous, and they have a large presence online, too, selling things that they buy in the stores. And they buy a lot of stuff. I've had much more luck at Bookman's than I've had at places like Half Price Books. What Bookman's does is kind of unique in places that I've been to. Like, for example, I went out to LA a couple of years ago and brought a couple of boxes of books with me because I was moving and I didn't really have anywhere to put them. And I was like, of course there will be large used bookstores in the enormous LA sprawl, because why wouldn't there be? And I discovered that there was nothing really like Bookman's in the greater LA area. Like there are definitely bookstores in LA, but in terms of a used bookstore that is, say, the size of a supermarket or larger, I think I went to one, and it was not the kind of experience that I expected to have exactly. And I don't remember what the name of the store was. I know it's in downtown LA, and there may be others, but I do know that it was really difficult to find anything. So the point of this particular anecdote is that there are often things in places that you don't expect. Like if I had to say, here's a state that has a really robust local chain of used bookstores, Arizona would not be the first state that came to mind, and yet I know it exists because I'm here. So I know that many, many other things like that must exist. The other thing is that the internet is so much your friend for books, and I know that people have mixed opinions about Amazon, whether it's Amazon, the site itself, or sellers operating on Amazon. I've bought plenty of books there. I'm not going to pretend like I haven't, but with that said, there are also tons and tons of independent bookstores that use the internet. In fact, some of the ones that we've mentioned have storefronts online, including Mysterious Galaxy from San Diego, both specialty stores and non-specialty stores that you can go onto and read about and have books sent to you in a way that obviously doesn't replicate the in-store experience, but it's possible. The internet is the great equalizer.
The great democratizing influence, except when it isn't. And I think, for me, the current beef with Amazon is that they've made it really difficult for indie authors to sell their books at price or to be accessed. It has to do with when you go to a book's page, a book sale page. You used to be that you could buy directly from the author or the publisher, and that would be like the first option on the page. And now Amazon recently shifted things around so that authors have been pushed completely off of their book sale pages, which means that you're often seeing used books, resold books, before you're seeing the author's the author's new books. And that's a real problem, because if you're not funneling the money to the authors directly, or at least some of the money directly to the authors, I'm as much a fan of buying used books as anyone, but if there's a book like Sarah Gailey's River of Teeth that's available, I want to buy it from Sarah Gailey so that all the royalties go to her. I don't want to buy a used copy for a book that I'm buying to support the author. Like, I deliberately want to support Sarah Gailey in writing more books like River of Teeth. And shout out there, the sequel is already available for pre-order, so make sure you get on that. Whereas it seems like Barnes & Noble at least hasn't yet opted to do something similar. They haven't shafted their indie authors, but Barnes & Noble, of course, is its own kettle of fish, as we like to say. The only thing that's pushed me away from Amazon, I'm discontinuing my Amazon Prime membership because Amazon supports Breitbart News. And at this point, at this juncture, Barnes & Noble doesn't. So until Breitbart News is no longer supported by Amazon, I will purchase my online books through Barnes & Noble. And that's just kind of a ethical decision that I've made. But getting back to bookstores.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the weird holes in the walls places. I said that weird, but the hole in the wall places.
Oh, okay. I was like, places with holes in their walls.
Places with holes in their walls.
Hole in the wall. I have a feeling you're thinking of something in particular. Wink.
It is a store that we visited together. This is one of the three in Coeur d'Alene. So we visited the Well-Read Moose. We also visited two others, Browsers, Uncommon Books, and Bookworm. And did we visit them in that order? Or did we? No, we did the Well-Read Moose the following day. We did Browsers, Uncommon Books, and then the Bookworm. And I have to say, we started at a high point for me, because it turns out Browsers, Uncommon Books is one of those dinky little hole-in-the-wall places, which is literally packed to the rafters with really interesting and weird and obscure books. And the gentleman who runs it, not only does he have an excellent Twitter presence where he promotes his books that he finds, but he also is pretty scrupulous in what he allows into the store. So while we were there, he received a number of phone calls from people inquiring if they could dump their books on him. And his answer was, I might take one or two, but he's pretty selective about what he takes in. And the quality of used books in there was really high. There was just like one small corner of sci-fi, but the nonfiction was a really, really great section. There were some great literary fiction books as well. And so that became, for me, probably the most exciting and serendipitous find of that particular weekend, because I hadn't expected anything out of this place. It looks like nothing from the outside, but you walk in and then suddenly it feels like 200 books are going to fall on your head, and they're all books that you want to read. Which is like a really neat feeling. It's very, very claustrophobic in there and hard to move around. But by being hard to move around, it forces you to slow down and look at the actual books on the shelves. So maybe it's clever.
And all right, I'm going to jump back to our point about bookstores being welcoming. I think that, especially when we're talking about folks who work there, recommendations, all that good stuff, there's a really fine line in bookstores in particular between, I'm coming into your bookstore, leave me the fuck alone until I have a chance to look through the books, and I'm coming into your bookstore, I might have some things that I'm thinking of, but like I do want to talk to someone who like knows what they're talking about and who can give me recommendations and things like that. So it's a really, really fine line. Like I want to say hello when I walk in, and then I kind of want to be left alone for a while. And I mentioned that here because I didn't mention it back there. But also, I mention it here because there's a fine line for these hole-in-the-wall places wherein they can either be a really glorious find or, like, awful. Mm-hmm. And when I say awful, I have a hard time saying that any place that sells books is awful. But I'm thinking of a store like that in a place where I grew up, which I will not name even the place because you'll probably be able to figure it out just based on that. But it's very similar in that it's like an old place. You want to romanticize it. Like there are books stacked in the aisles. Like it's kind of rickety looking. Like it doesn't look like, it's run by older folks who make it pretty clear that they're doing it for the love of doing it. But this bookshop is so full of like crappy pulps that are in trade paperback and are marked up from like, very clearly they say on the back cover like $2.99 or something, and they're charging like $4 for it used in like this old ass bookstore. And I hated that bookstore, and that it made me so angry the couple of times I went in there that it kind of like tainted my opinion of those kind of like rinky-dink, rickety looking bookstores. I'm happy to say that this bookstore, Browsers Uncommon Books, really helped not undo that, because I've been into plenty of those since, but like, it was definitely more in the good category. When you go into a bookstore like that and you're immediately greeted by kind of the door opens and you have to twist yourself around, a few stacks of books are just sitting there, and then there's shelves behind that, like all the way up to the ceiling, like you said, and I'm just kind of like, what the hell, how do I even start this? Like, is there organization? Like, do I start looking for like authors? Do I just walk through? And, there is something to be said for like forcing you to sort of like stop and, I'm gonna kick over that fucking pile of books if I keep walking, so I'm just gonna like look at this shelf. But on the other hand, like, here's where the fine line comes in. If I then look at that bookshelf and see like, pulpy romances mixed in with like giant old children's encyclopedias mixed in with like God knows what, like, I'm gonna be like, no, fuck this bookstore, I'm out. Browsers Uncommon Books did not do that at all.
It had an
in fact, it
like,
was.
We asked about the
no,
organization.
it definitely had organization, right?
Yeah.
So this is something that like, when I'm going into bookstores for the first time and they're that kind of bookstore, that's what I'm going to look for. Like, you can be as messed up as you want, you can be as old-fashioned. I love it. There's romance to it. Like, I want to feel like I'm going into an old attic and poking around, but like, I also want to feel like I'm going into an old attic that someone actually cares about.
Sure.
Because if you're trying to sell me things that are disorganized or marked up when they're used in pulpy, like, I'm not going to think that you care, or like, that you are purposely selling to like older folks who are going to pay you $4 for that novel. But what I found in this place is that, I got a really, really beautiful, large, like, notebook size, thick, illustrated book or guide to North American birds for less than $4. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I saw one book in that store that wasn't, like, antique or autographed or both that was more than $4. So I think we each got, Andrew and I, and then you, got 10 or more books. And it was like, easily under $30 for each of us.
An additional nice feature was if you bought 10 books, you got half off or something like that.
Right.
So in addition to each book being under $4, you also got roughly 50% off if you were willing to shell out that much, which really, like, if you're going to buy 5 books, you should go ahead and buy 10 books, and then you get them for five books worth of money. And that was just like, it was a neat system. I liked that he was willing to engage with us when we asked. He was not at all like push-offy, but he also, like, he let us have our space. We hung out there for like 45 minutes before we came up.
Yeah,
and this is a tiny, tiny place, so we're never more than like 15 feet from him. But you felt like you were given your space and your privacy, which was nice. And other people came in while we were there. A couple of them had never been in before, and it was clear that a couple of them had. And so it was very much a store where you go slow, you come in, you immediately feel that this is the vibe, or you are taught by the way that things are set up in there that this is the vibe and what is expected of you. And so it was a store with standards, which I appreciated, but it was a store that was also welcoming. And I would contrast that to the Bookworm, the other store we visited immediately after, which wasn't a bad used bookstore. In fact, especially when you went into like literary fiction and some of the other genres on the far side of the building, it had a really good selection. But when it came to sci-fi, it was pretty much trade paperbacks, and they weren't knocked down in price significantly. I picked up a fair number of books there simply because they had about 5 books by Sherry Tepper, who I'm trying to catch up on, and it's hard to find Sherry Tepper these days for an affordable price. So I picked up Sherry Tepper there, but that was a case where The store owner was not really around while we were browsing. She kind of was in a back room, and when she was out, she was on her cell phone. And it wasn't. This isn't me being judgy, like, oh, young people these days being on their cell phones. It was just a very different approach. Like, she was very, very standoffish. She was willing to engage when we went up and made it clear that I was going to purchase some books. But apart from that, it was very, very hands off. And it felt radically different. It wasn't an intimate feel. It was a utilitarian feel. There were a lot of good books, but it wasn't quite the thing that made me fall in love with Browser's Uncommon Books. So if you're in Coeur d'Alene, we encourage you to check out all 3 of the bookstores we've talked about there, and to give us your feedback. They're all on the list of places I would go back to for sure.
Right. For all of our listeners who are in northern Idaho for reasons.
I don't know if we have any listeners at all. So if you're in northern Idaho and you're listening to this, that's a miracle in and of itself. Congrats.
Yeah.
So going back to our kind of guiding questions for this podcast, I guess I'm curious about what all can a bookstore be other than a place that houses books? Because you're not falling in love with the place just because it offers books. You're falling in love with a variety of things, I think. And I guess I'm curious what makes for that magical recipe for you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. What I will say, and this is, I know, probably going to go against the grain for a lot of people, but I am not really into events all that much. I don't really go to readings very often. So bookstores that, are really heavily invested in community events, this is going to sound weird and like double-edged. That's something that I look for, but I don't go to. Like, if there's a bookstore that has a really full calendar of events, I'll be like, oh, quality place. But I usually won't go to those events. It just, like, it speaks well of the place that's doing them. And part of that is, like, I'm thinking of all the places that we've named so far, except for Bookman's in Arizona. I don't live in any of those places, so obviously I'm not going to go to them. So I guess I'm thinking more specifically, if I'm in a place I don't live and I want to spend my time and my money at a bookstore, like, what are the things that are going to make me go back to that place if I'm there again? And I'm thinking of a place like Borderlands in San Francisco, and that is one of them. The fact that they're so engaged and always have writers coming through, that's awesome.
Now, which was the bookstore where Charlie Jane Andrews hosts her Drinks with Friends series? Because that is in San Francisco.
It might have been that.
It was the one where you got the Sarah Gailey book.
It was it's Borderlands.
Okay. Yeah. Because she that was the event. She was there for the Drinks with Friends. And I was like, oh, you should go. And you're like, no, we're getting in that night. I'm not going to a book reading. Same night we get into San Francisco. And I was like, ah!
Yeah, that definitely would have been fun, but, like, we had driven for 13 hours and we missed, like, the first half. So, yeah. So like, for me, I am an event whore. I love events so much. And that's partly because I'm a librarian, and nothing raises the profile of a library and raises the profile of a book than a book reading. And so they're just a lot of fun to go to, not just because, like, utilitarian reasons, like, I know this book is going to do better because it's having a reading, or this author is going to feel more support because they're doing a reading, but also because, like, it is a chance for the community to come out. And in a small town like ours in rural Montana, a book reading is really like a highlight of the week for a lot of people. I remember when the author of the Longmire books came into town and gave a reading. And of course, Longmire is adapted for television and is incredibly popular. And the author came in and read at our library and gave it wasn't a presentation, it was just like a casual kind of Q&A. And that packed out our library. We had like 100 people in that room talking with him. And it was great. Craig Johnson is a great person to talk to. But that elevated people's interest in the library. It elevated people's interest in our other books. People then came streaming back across the hallway to browse all of our other books. And so in general, like, we saw this spike in our library attendance, which was great. And so there's so many reasons to like events on my part as a librarian. And I can't at this point really separate out the librarian and the private reader, because I didn't have any chances to attend readings when I was a kid. I think I compelled my parents to attend their first ever reading. I think it was me who made them do it. And again, it was because there was a reading here in Montana, and then the author went to visit the corner of Denver in which my parents live. And so I compelled them to then go to her reading in the Denver area. And it prompted a renewed interest in a different set of books, which was great.
So readings are a great way to introduce people, and events are a great way to introduce people who otherwise wouldn't come into a library to the offerings that a library or a bookstore has. And this is me completely off topic and ranting, but because I came to them late, I only discovered readings in graduate school when they became compulsory. Like you have to actually give a reading as a graduate student in an MFA program. And that kind of forced me to actually step inside some of the indie bookstores in Tucson, like Antigone Books, which we haven't mentioned yet. And is a fairly popular, I want to say, feminist bookstore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
And gives a lot of great readings and throws a lot of great events on subjects to do with social science, the female, the human body. I mean, not all of the books in there are written by women, I don't think. And I don't think the events are being thrown specifically to cater to women. I think just the fact that it's a feminist bookstore means that a lot of the people going in are. And it's a great example of a niche bookstore that knows what it's doing and does it very well and still manages to be welcoming to outsiders like me. So yeah, Antigone is another one that we should probably throw out there on the list. Are there any bookstores that we haven't mentioned that played an important role in your like bookstore development, bookstore browser development?
None that I can really think of. Bookman's was, I mean, I've been going to Bookman's for years and years and years since I was in undergrad, so it's one of those Arizona fixtures.
And I love the business model, which here in Montana, in Missoula, where I do not live but I visit regularly, there's a bookstore called the Book Exchange, which is new and used books. And in that sense, it's a lot like the Tattered Cover in Denver, but the Book Exchange is exactly what its name suggests. You bring in your books. They won't take all of them. They'll maybe take like a quarter or a third of the books that you bring in. And then you get store credit, which you can apply towards books that you want to take off of the shelves and take home with you. And in a sense, it operates a little bit like a lending library in that sense, in that you're constantly cycling books in and out. But it's also a little different in that if you find a book that you love, you usually end up keeping it. And then you have to go and actually spend some money at the store. So the Book Exchange is a great, great place. I would like to also throw out a mention to rare bookstores. There's another one in Missoula, which is across from Fact and Fiction, and it's called the Bird's Nest Rare Books. And if you ever come up, Tony, I'm going to have to take you, because this is a bookstore which has a fairly large footprint, and it winds on, and it's mostly really old, obscure books, which is maybe not as useful in some subject areas, but when it comes to sci-fi, right now I'm trying to get in touch with the Golden Age sci-fi and the feminist women authors who are responding to Golden Age sci-fi, like Sherry Tepper. And so they have a lot of great books to satisfy that thirst. They've also got a lot of great, really obscure poetry, and they have like vinyl records, and they have old children's books. And it's a real walk back in time. It's only open obscure hours. I don't know how they afford the building rent, but it's a great, great place. They're not known for very friendly, overly friendly staff. They're a place where if you walk in, you will be left entirely alone the entire time. But you still, because it goes back and back, it's an adventure. And I found Tracks there, the nonfiction book about a woman who decides to cross Australia by taming her own camels and then walking from Alice Springs to the west coast of Australia. And I've found a variety of great nonfiction books in there that are a little bit more contemporary than that, and some sci-fi as well. So rare bookstores are also a great place if you're willing to shell out a little bit more money, because generally they don't mark down their books as much. Anything else you can think of?
Well, if I can go back to your question about what actually, what makes a bookstore a special place, events are definitely one of the things, but there's a whole host of things that keep me coming back. We already said recommendations. We already said that great balance of staff that cares that you're there but doesn't care enough or doesn't overcare. Mm-hmm. We don't want helicopter staff. The physical place is something that I feel like we don't want to undervalue. Because I'm just thinking of like random shit here, like if your bookstore's floors are too squeaky because you're in like an old place, but it's maybe a little too old and you should have those floors redone. Like that's something that in bookstores really bothers me. Like I will notice if a place has squeaky floors, and that's such a bizarre thing to notice, but it's quiet, I'm looking around, like if there's a section of the floor I don't want to step on, like I will notice that. How much light there is, if it's noisy, if there's a lot of street noise, if the shelves are too close together, if I feel like I'm going to knock something over. On the other hand, if it's too spacious and I feel like there aren't enough books, like they're not making good use of the space. if it, if there's like really logical, like shelves are exactly this many inches or feet apart, as opposed to like kind of like winding through the store, like in Dark Carnival in Berkeley, where there is definitely some winding going on in that store, and it's really fun. All of these things contribute to my physical presence in the bookstore as, a place in space. And I will want to go there if it's welcoming in whatever ways. So
yeah,
and I feel like that kind of like that alchemy. I couldn't say, or rather, I could say for a store like Borderlands, or a store like Mysterious Galaxy, or a store even like Bookman's in Tucson. Like these are the things that combine to make this a good experience for me as someone looking for books. But what works in Bookman's would not work in Borderlands. They are very, very different stores. So there isn't like one thing that makes a successful bookstore, but all of the ones we've mentioned, I think, are successful bookstores for reasons, including variations on themes that we've mentioned throughout this podcast.
Even the lighting level. So there is something aesthetic about a library, which is really important. And I felt a little bit in The Well-Read Moose that there were like spotlights, like gallery lighting. It was very like dramatic lighting, but it wasn't too bright, and I really appreciated that. And I loved the supremely low light levels in Browser's Uncommon Books. There was something very appealing about the fact, and I think it was because they had one window and a lot of bookshelves between the sci-fi corner and that window. And then to contrast that with Bookworm, also in Coeur d'Alene, it was very spacious. It had a lot of books in there, but it was very well lit. And it was just like a very different, it felt more like a grocery store shopping experience. Like you should go in knowing which section to aim for, go, get your books and go, which isn't as slow and meandering and winding as of an experience, which isn't to say that it isn't useful. Like you need bookstores like that also, because if you're in a hurry and you want to grab some sci-fi, you probably don't want to go into Browser's Uncommon and lose 45 minutes. You probably want to go into Bookworm and grab like 10 sci-fi paperbacks and take off in like 5 minutes. So I mean, there's definitely value in all the different kinds, but there's something magical about the darkened bookstore for me. A little scary, but also like
I think that's fine.
So to
the final
go.
The final note I wanted to say is kind of something that you mentioned already, but the importance of bookstores for what feels like my support of authors who I like. And I'm thinking mostly of bookstores that sell new books, whether they're specifically new books or a mix of new and used. Like, again, thinking of Borderlands in San Francisco, like I went in and I bought outright Sarah Gailey's River of Teeth. In a previous visit, I outright bought Garth Nix's Golden Hand and a number of other books. We've bought now a couple of books by N.K. Jemisin there. I could list off a whole bunch. But the point is here, for me, that feels different than buying something online. Even though, rationally, I'm like, well, if I go to, say, the Mysterious Galaxy website versus the Mysterious Galaxy storefront in San Diego, there really isn't much of a difference there. I'm getting the book either way. It's just, going to San Diego, which only happens every once in a while, versus, getting a package in the mail. But it feels like, obviously there's a difference there in what your experience is, but that also feels like when I'm buying from stores like that, I'm a little bit closer to the authors in some way, and it sounds silly, but it also feels like there's more personal support behind that decision. And I know that that's not entirely ridiculous because, you're not only supporting the independent bookstores, but you're supporting the authors themselves. But that's, the final, well, not the final, but one really important final note for me and what I look for, what I feel when I go into stores like the ones we've mentioned.
I mean, in all the important ways, when you walk into a bookstore, you're among friends. And you're walking among minds which might ping off of yours. And I think I do go to bookstores for the unexpected. I don't tend to go to bookstores just to pick up one book that I know I want. I go in to pick up the one book that I know I want, and also to have my mind ping off of all of these stimulating book covers, to pick up and physically handle, tactily, explore some new books. And like I would not have picked up Neil Gaiman's The Sleeper and the Spindle if I had not gone into a bookstore and picked it up. And there's so many books like that, which I could name. And that to me is the magic, where yes, there are predictable, wonderful outcomes to just buying books that you know that you want from bookstores. But it's also the chance to encounter something new and something serendipitous. So for sure, I recommend that. Now, I picked up 22 books within 24 hours in Coeur d'Alene. And I have read maybe 4 of them. And I've also read some books that we've grabbed from the library. Now, since this is our first kind of podcast back from your vacation hiatus, what have you been reading lately? What do you think we should talk about next? Throw out some ideas.
Oh, Lord. Okay, so I've been on Nnedi Okorafor Bender.
Okay.
I have
It's
read
a really good Bender.
Butterwitch and Binti and Binti Home in the last
and you've read Lagoon.
Week and a half.
You've read Lagoon.
And I read Lagoon a while ago.
Have you read Who Fears Death yet? That one's been picked up by HBO.
No, I bought it, but I bought it, but I haven't read it.
And that
yet.
One's been picked up for production by HBO, which is really cool.
Yeah, that'll be coming up. I've read a lot. Probably the thing that is most, apart from Nnedi Okorafor's work, there's a trilogy on my mind that begins with the book The Three-Body Problem.
Yeah, which I have on
continues
top
through the
of
Dark
my
Forest
list now. Yeah.
And wraps up with Death's Head. But I really, really want to talk about that and everything that it does. And especially, maybe turn that into an episode on science fiction and fantasy in translation and what other books there might be. Because I found also in San Francisco while I was in Japantown, there's a bookstore. I would not be able to think of the name off the top of my head, but they had a section, an entire section of fiction by either Japanese authors that had been translated into English or Japanese American authors. And I found some books that looked like really awesome science fiction. And then when I came home, I didn't buy them then because by the end of the trip I was running a little low on the monies. But I took photos of them, I wrote them down. I came back, the library did not have one of those books. So I had to special order them through the library.
So interlibrary loan, woot woot.
I did. So we'll see what those end up being. But I would like to do something with that because I realize that, for all of the important conversations that we and the science fiction and fantasy communities of writers and readers have had at large about representation and diversity and other really important things, I have really not read much work that's not by, if not American authors, then authors who are writing primarily in English.
Right, yeah, and I think it's far more common to read nonfiction, for example, in translation or from abroad than it is to read genre fiction. And there, except for in the very specific case of British sci-fi. British sci-fi is extremely popular in America, and we have read Chris Beckett's Dark Eden, and in fact I found one of his novels or short novels that is not from the Dark Eden series in one of those used bookstores in Coeur d'Alene. So I will report back on that. But there's another book which we are hoping to get to, I think, assuming you can find it at your library.
I found it.
Okay, which is The Spaceman of Bohemia. And this one was recommended to us by a listener who is also a former graduate school cohort member, friend, person of ours. And that person is Park. So we're hoping to read The Spaceman of Bohemia and also to bring on Park to talk a little bit about his reading experience with it and provide us with some inroads. So look for podcasts about the Three-Body Problem. I don't know if we'll get through all 3 of them before we podcast about it, but I will get through the first one for sure. And Spaceman of Bohemia. I think those are kind of like the top 2 on my list. And we'll talk more also about things like I would like to dip into maybe cyberpunk a little bit and translation and some of these other perhaps genres or subgenres that we don't normally talk about. So, yeah. So, Tony, where can you find us on social media?
So you can find us primarily on Twitter. We are at imaginary_pod. You will find out through that account when we post new episodes on iTunes, on SoundCloud, and on YouTube. We also have a new website.
This is a bit of a change, so pay attention.
Which is at imaginaries.net, I believe.
Yeah, so it's no longer imaginaries.us. We will try and go back and fix all of our broken links once that goes down. But we are switching to a Squarespace account, which is just beautiful. And we're hoping to fill it up with some really quality content over the months to come. I know we keep saying that, but this time I really mean it. So we'll post links to our podcast there. And we will also hopefully work out some of the kinks in the fact that you can only listen to the last 5 podcasts in iTunes. That's something that's also on my list of things to do, which it's a long list of things to do because I've got to finish this NASA grant thing. I've got to start grad school in the next month, and I'm starting a picture book on invasive species. So I'm relatively busy, and I know that you're starting back school as well. So you're relatively all over the map as well.
Yep, that's why I'm back.
Yay! So thank you so much for listening to our somewhat rambly show today. If you have a favorite indie or otherwise kind of bookstore that you want to share with us, please hop on Twitter and hit the @button and tag us on that. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any recommendations for books to move to the top of our many, many piles, we would also appreciate that insight. So look forward to talking at you again soon, guys.
Bye.